if it did work, it would in some ways be worse than a nuclear weapon, because it could be used to create an explosive force. It would disperse highly radioactive material far and wide. Hafnium-178 had a 31-year half-life, dwarfing the radioactivity of uranium, the material used in nuclear weapons. The isomer bomb, he said, would be the world's best radiological dispersal device. And how did he know it wouldn't work? It's a bit like Potter Stewart's definition of pornography, he said, referring to the Supreme Court Justice's famous 1973 "I know it when I see it" description. One knows bad science, and after a while learns to recognize it as such. That said, he had checked out the claims. Zimmerman explained that he'd served in government a few years back. He had commissioned a high-level panel of elite scientists, a secretive group called the Jasons, to look at the hafnium bomb. The Jasons, I asked? I'd never heard of the Jasons. It was as if there was a whole underworld of national security I knew nothing about. The Jasons, Zimmerman explained, were a group of secretive elite scientists who held some of the highest security clearances. Access provided to them so they could review any technical matter facing government. For hafnium, the Jasons' determination was conclusive. The science was dubious and such a weapon simply wasn't feasible. Hafnium couldn't be made into a bomb for a host of scientific and technical reasons. It was too radioactive to be around. It was too expensive to produce. There was no way to get the chain reaction needed for an explosion. The original experiment in 1998, the panel concluded, was not solid proof of anything. In essence, the Jasons conclude the whole thing didn't pass what Zimmerman liked to call the Snicker test. And other things about the initial experiment struck Zimmerman as bad science. The Texas scientist's former student was disavowing the original results. And he added, there were other rumors, though unconfirmed. There had been some funny business with obtaining the hafnium. And of course, there was a basic issue with the experiment, a dental x-ray machine. Despite all that, according to Zimmerman, the Pentagon had already assembled a group of senior scientists to look at ways to mass-produce the hafnium isomer, an endeavor that would run the tens of billions of dollars. One of the scientists of the production panel, a Stanford physicist named William Hermansfeld, was trying to kill the whole thing, he told me. You should call him, he said. For a moment, I considered the possibility that Zimmerman was pulling my leg. I tried to imagine calling up a scientist I'd never met and asking about a secret Pentagon nuclear hand grenade. If it were true, I couldn't imagine he'd talk about it. And if it weren't true, I'd sound ridiculous. There was something about the whole idea that seemed unbelievable. If the weapon couldn't work, I asked, what difference did it make what the Pentagon dreamt up, be it a nuclear-style bazooka or a nuclear hand grenade? At some point, like dozens of other Pentagon projects, the whole thing, the Pentagon would simply give up. Zimmerman paused and leaned back in his chair and then gave a philosophical reply. He had a long-term view of the hafnium bomb. I think that a program like this, once started, will have an enormous amount of inertia, he said. It won't be a matter of someone deciding this is just a waste of money. It will stick around for years and likely grow in scope. His concerns also went well beyond the science. Then there's the international relations aspect of it, he said. Do we want to advertise that we're going to build a new nuclear-type weapon based on new physical principles? What sort of message does this send to our allies, to other countries? Dental x-rays, big bombs, and mad scientists. The whole thing sounded implausible. The Pentagon was certainly known for pursuing some unconventional ideas, but a super bomb based on a dental x-ray? By the time we bid goodbye, I already knew that I would call William Hermansfeld and that I would try to learn more about the hafnium bomb. I had embarked on a journey that day, and without quite knowing it, I had crossed some threshold. I was entering a scientific underworld I never knew existed. This book is an attempt to explore that fuzzy line between military science and official foolishness. When an unusual little experiment becomes a Pentagon boondoggle. The hafnium bomb began with the idea of building a handheld device with the explosive power approaching that of a nuclear bomb. It was, in the truest sense of the word, an imaginary weapon. In the end, all it took was a used dental x-ray machine, a few die-hard supporters, some far-fetched claims of a new arms race, and the Pentagon thought it was on its way to the next super bomb. I'm going to spend just a couple minutes talking about then the story that emerges from this book and the reaction I've had to it. I feel like this book is about two things. It's about the kind of the 2-year journey I went on trying to find out how that dental x-ray machine went in 1998 to being a full-scale, sort of weapons exploratory project in the Pentagon by 2003. But it also began a secondary theme of, what does the scientific underworld really mean, and how do we know what is good science and what's bad science? And as a country, what our national security institutions should look into and fund. And so through this 2 years, I found everything in the Pentagon from psychics and telepathy to zero-point energy and claims of infinite energy. The story of the hafnium bomb then became sort of a microcosm, one way of telling a larger story of the many, many weird and fringy projects the Pentagon gets involved in. But the real question is, when does something go off the deep end? And I don't know that there's a good answer to that. In the case of the hafnium bomb, this is really a story about one true believer, a scientist in Texas named Carl Collins, who for 20 years had been working in this esoteric area of nuclear isomers, these charged up nucleus, trying to make a breakthrough that he thought would make his name in science. In the 1980s, under Ronald Reagan's Star Wars, he'd been funded to work on nuclear isomers as part of building a gamma-ray laser, a sort of theoretical concept. When Star Wars was canceled, he went on to other projects, eventually coming over to hafnium in 1998 with what became the famous dental X-ray experiment, which was in fact published in a very, very prestigious journal, Physical Review Letters. With the publication of his results from the dental X-ray experiment, he immediately began to get noticed. Everyone from the CIA to the DIA to the State Department took notice. And eventually he got tens of millions of dollars, or the project got tens of millions of dollars from the Pentagon, and the idea that these results could be the basis of an isomer bomb. What becomes problematic in the story of the isomer bomb is that every single review, there were 2 independent government-sponsored reviews that said it was bunk. There were counter-experiments done in the Department of Energy laboratories which contradicted the results. And his own collaborators, his former student, went on to say these results couldn't be replicated. And yet the Pentagon didn't give up. So this book really traces how a group of Pentagon officials sort of coalesced around this very charismatic Texas scientist and began to really hype these results. And it also talks about my own experience dealing with this Texas scientist who, in many ways, I think is a very tragic story, who really wanted to make a breakthrough in science that never happened. And the more he came under attack, really began to strike back very personally. Now, the question of what makes bad science and good science, I think, is still something under review. The book talks about other strange things the Pentagon has been involved in. For instance, one of the very well-known cases was during the Cold War and up through 1995, the military and intelligence community funded psychics. The idea, we could have people, tracing out new nuclear Soviet submarines or, spot things through remote viewing. Another example was $25,000 the Air Force spent on a study of teleportation. This is sort of a Star Trek concept. There's been long-standing interest in concepts of infinite energy ranging from cold fusion to zero-point energy. And after the book was published, I got, along with some very nice reaction, a long list of letters from former psychics, current psychics, people involved in zero-point energy, cold fusion, anti-gravitious, people saying, well, how do you know that our idea doesn't work? Have you explored our idea? How come you've grouped it all under fringe science? And the truth is, we don't know that none of these things work. I know that the isomer bomb was certainly flawed because I looked at 2 years' worth of evidence of internal reports, external reports, of a coalition, a consensus of scientists who said that the 1998 experiments were flawed. I have not looked at every study on psychics, and yes, the military did a number of studies on psychics. I have not looked at every scientific paper on zero-point energy. I don't really understand all of the anti-gravity concepts, but I'm pretty sure it doesn't come from alien technology like some of these people believe. We shouldn't say it all relies on common sense, but what unites all of these ideas is that the mainstream scientific community rejects them. The mainstream scientific community has looked at these results and says it doesn't meet our standards. They say either that the results aren't good enough or they just aren't scientific. And by the way, we only study natural phenomena. When it comes to national security, what I would say is if you don't want to rely on the scientific community, if you want to fund projects, what are you going to rely on? The world is full of perpetual motion machines. It is full of people who have strange ideas. And if you aren't going to rely on technical advice, on scientists, and on peer review, you're going to be funding a lot of strange things, and a lot stranger things than the isomer bomb. In terms of some of the other kind of interesting things that I got as a result of this, is that Carl Collins, the main scientist behind these results, launched his own website to defend himself in some unusual ways, and kind of began a personal vendetta in defending his results. And this, in a sense, was an extension of a lot of things that were talked about in this book. That every time someone criticized him, it became a very, very personal campaign rather than a scientific campaign. And that's another feature that I see in the scientific underworld, that rather than trying to work on new results, better results, a lot of people on the edges of science simply say, you don't understand my results. The other experiments were flawed. The system is against me. The scientific community just doesn't work right. And I guess my answer to that is, what is a better system? Over the past week, I had just a wonderful email conversation with a